right, welcome back to another episode of the Psychopedia podcast. I'm your host, Investigator Slater, and I have already had an insane morning. At least it felt insane to me. I don't know. Upon reflection, maybe it wasn't that crazy. First of all, I woke up because I was having a legit fever dream about Britney Spears dancing in front of me holding a very sharp fork. Then I went online and I saw that recently she did dance in front of the camera holding a fork. So now I feel like I have some kind of third eye or something because I don't follow Britney Spears. It's like I wouldn't have known about that video. Strange. And in my dream, I kept saying, you're an independent woman. You can dance and do whatever you want because that's how I feel about Britney. But maybe put down the weapon, like put down the sharp fork. So strange, but so real at the same time. And then after I woke up, got myself together, I had to go to my son's school for Heritage Fair, like a Heritage Day fair. So my son, both of my sons, obviously, they're like a mixture of myself and my husband. Shocking how that works, right? So they have German, Irish, English, Russian, Austrian, Polish, and I found out recently that I'm 0.0001% Polynesian, which is incredible. And now I feel like a lot cooler, honestly, if you must know by default. But my son chose to go with Russia for Heritage Day. So I go to the fair this morning and I have to pass through all these other children's little displays before I get to my son. And there's Colombia, and the little girl's so cute. She has like a basket of fruit on her head and she's in the traditional garb. And I get to my son's table. I know he's doing Russia. Who does he have on his poster board? Or what does he have on his poster board? A giant fucking picture of Putin. Just a giant picture of Putin with like his fist in the air. You can't tell me his teacher wasn't fucking with me or something. Like, what was that? What was that? So I have to like hold back, not my displeasure, maybe that's like my shock, that for sure. But yeah, I'm looking at my son and I'm like, oh, honey, like this, great job. First of all, great job. I'm reading what you wrote about Russia. Very cool. Yeah, so like what's up with the picture? Like how did this work out? And yeah, he and his teacher worked on it together like after hours because he missed a lot of school because he was sick with allergies. And that's the picture they settled on. So I don't know. I was in this weird place for the rest of the day, to be honest. And then I came to recording. So this is my happy place. This is my relief. And this feels like a lot more sane than what I just experienced at the Heritage Fair. And by sane, I mean completely insane because this case is bananas, guys. It's bananas. I hadn't heard of this case prior to doing some digging on like an ancillary topic that I was interested in. You know that I work as an investigator working with survivors of sexual abuse and sex crimes. So I have my ear to the ground just generally with that subject matter. And that's how I landed on this case. Absolutely bananas. I don't know why this case isn't more enmeshed in the true crime world, unless it is and I'm missing it. That's totally possible. Anyway, welcome back to the podcast. If this is your first time here, welcome. If it is your 100 and whatever time here, welcome home, freak. Very, very, very happy, as always, to have you here with me. Just a quick, request, please, if you wouldn't mind subscribing on Apple, Spotify. As you know, because we've said it, I've said it 100 times, it helps so much with the algorithm. And especially now that I'm on my own doing this, any little push that I can get with Psychopedia is tremendous. If you don't want to subscribe, it is what it is. I love you all the same, and I'm just happy that you're listening. If you love what you're hearing and you want more of it, and you want some other interesting stuff that's going to be dropping on Patreon, join us. It's patreon.com/psychopediapod. Different tiers, different levels. We're going to be shaking things up over there. So just kind of keep your eye on it. If you weren't interested in joining hitherto, nice. Maybe you will be, interested after you see what else we have to offer. On that note, I'm going to read you guys a couple of Patreon names. This is just a tradition here at Psychopedia. I love it because it gives a proper shout out to some really creative people over there. But by the way, you do not have to come up with a creative name at all. Do not let that actually hold you back from joining Patreon. I cannot tell you how many DMs I've gotten from people who are like, I can't wait to join Patreon once I come up with a name. Girl, guy, whatever you identify as, I love you for you. You don't need a flashy name. Come as you are, in the wise words of Kurt Cobain. Okay, so we have Desiree Joy. What's up, DJ? We have Cappuccino Mafia. I don't know if that comes from a case or not. I was racking my brain. I don't know it. I love cappuccinos and I'm interested in mafia, so it works for me regardless. Satan's pamphlet on buff nuns. Fantastic. That's obviously a nod to the pamphlet/book that I referenced in our Anna Eklund's exorcism case, and I could not get off the fact that there were these really athletic nuns that helped with the exorcism. So that's that. The Great American Bush Titty, which is a bird that I mentioned, I think like in 2 or 3 episodes ago. Heather Hernandez. What's up, Heather? Psychopedia Galactica. Excellent. And this freak is home. And that name really warms my heart because anybody on Patreon and anybody listening here, I hope this feels like home for you because I am your dark queen/dark mom. That was weird. That was just weird. We can forget I ever said that. I'm just happy you're here. I love you all so much. And without further ado, I'm going to take you into this week's case. I don't know what the fuck happened. He's dead. He's in my room. It's a mess. It really is a mess. That was a quote from the perpetrator that we're obviously going to be talking about. When the front door creaked open in the early morning of July 17th, 2022 on Botley Drive, a quiet residential street in Lee Park, Havant, Hampshire, in the southern part of England, took everything I had not to pronounce it Hampshire. Police officers were greeted by a 27-year-old single mother wearing a pink bathrobe, smoking a cigarette, and talking on her phone. The woman's face and neck were heavily tattooed, and her entire face was covered in at least a dozen piercings. The woman asked police what was going on and why they were at her home, all with an eerily calm expression and steady voice, which you guys know, that creeps me out almost more than anything when it comes to perpetrators. When they are chill, that's some fucked up shit. As if this woman were genuinely perplexed by their arrival, she just stood there staring at them. Law enforcement instructed the woman to keep her front door open as she began to subtly step back into her home, all while the scent of a chemical haze hit officers like a wave. Bleach. And beneath it, something fouler, a coppery, metallic undertone that clung to the walls and seeped into the air. Police indicated that they received, quote, a strange, interesting call about somebody having had their throat slit. And there, inside the home, blood splashed across the wall and a bookshelf in looping arcs. It soaked through the mattress and pooled on the floor. And in the middle of that chaos lay what was left of a 25-year-old man named Frankie Fitzgerald. He'd been absolutely eviscerated. His chest and neck slashed open in what appeared to be a frenzied, savage attack. But what surrounded the body added a whole new layer of horror to an already gut-churning scene. Hanging on the bedroom wall was a shrine to serial killers. Framed photos of Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, Richard Ramirez the Night Stalker, Myra Hindley, Jeffrey Dahmer, just to name a few, displayed like teen heartthrobs being admired and romanticized. Investigators learned that Shaye Groves, the woman at the door, devoured true crime docs, horror films, and murder forums like scripture written in blood. She read endless amounts of books relating to true crime, forensics, and police procedure, which is like a little relatable. Her coffin-shaped bookshelf looked like a psychological autopsy, meticulously curated, forensic, and dripping with obsession. All of this is to say, Shaye Groves didn't study crime out of curiosity. She studied it like she was method acting for a lead role that she very much intended to one day play. This is not a clear-cut case involving a crime of passion, which is ultimately sort of what it's been labeled as. It's about a disturbing fixation that metastasized. It's about a woman who walked the line between fandom and bloodlust, and then crossed it with a blade. This is the case of Shaye Groves, the rape-obsessed control killer. This might be a good time to issue a trigger warning that this case is very heavily steeped in issues involving sexual assault and rape, fetishism, BDSM, discussions of that nature. So just wanted to give you a warning. Okay, let's get into it. Shaye Groves was born in January 1996 in Havant, Hampshire, a coastal town in southern England with a population of about 125,000. Picturesque on the surface, Havant is known for its proximity to scenic countryside and the sandy shores of Hailing Island Beach. But beneath the postcard charm, difficult and darker stories unfolded for a young Shaye Groves who was met with hardship very early on in life. Diagnosed with hearing loss, Shaye was actually deaf in one ear and required hearing aids in both by the age of 11, a detail that sadly made her a very easy target for bullying in her childhood. Because some kids, unfortunately, be like that, which we all know. Shaye endured relentless bullying, mockery, and exclusion that began in primary school and reportedly shadowed her well into adolescence. Her world, already quieter than most, became isolating in ways that went far beyond her hearing loss. And the bullying was really only just the beginning, because around that same time, Shaye also began experiencing what would become a prolonged period of physical and sexual abuse. The exact identity of the perpetrator or perpetrators remains unclear. Some sources have pointed to a family member, others to a close acquaintance of the household. But what is known is that the trauma was persistent and deeply damaging, understandably. At just 13 years old, Shaye started carrying around a knife, not necessarily for protection, she would later claim, but rather for control, for power, for the feeling of safety that it gave her in a world that otherwise made her feel utterly powerless. In the years that followed, Shaye was diagnosed with multiple mental health conditions, including complex post-traumatic stress disorder and bipolar affective disorder. She began drinking heavily and experimenting with drugs, like hard drugs. These behaviors didn't go unnoticed. One former childhood friend would later describe Shaye as quote-unquote different from the other children, not in a dismissive way, but in a way that suggested that Shaye lived her life just slightly askew from those around her. She was imaginative, yes, but also very intense, detached, dark, and according to some sources close to her, manipulative. Pop quiz number 1. As a child, what was Shaye's number one interest? A. Reenacting horror movie killers with her Barbies. B. Chucky doll. C. Practicing her own funeral. All right, take a few seconds, you guys. The answer is B. Shaye was so obsessed with the horror film Child's Play that her classmates actually stopped using her real name and just started calling her Chucky, the murderous serial killer doll she idolized a little too much from that movie. Some of you guys may know this already because I've told this story before, but I was absolutely fucking traumatized by Chucky as a kid. I remember I just got out of the bath, my mom was combing my hair, and my brother put Chucky on the one TV, the one box TV we had in the house, and he forced me to watch it. And he knew that I was getting afraid, and I was holding in my arm Rose, who was my beloved baby doll that I took with me absolutely everywhere. Needless to say, after being forced by my brother to watch Chucky, I literally threw Rose down the basement steps and never looked at her again. And that is devastating because she was my baby. So I have some issues with Chucky. Now, despite being seen as different, dark, and disturbing, which is honestly something I wouldn't mind seeing on my tombstone one day, Shaye Groves was still, in many ways, the kind of kid who just slipped through the cracks, the kind whose suffering stayed just beneath the surface, invisible to the systems that might have stepped in if they'd bothered to truly look, because the signs were there, clear as day. The early fixation on violence, the shift in behavior, the withdrawn demeanor, the bullying, the all-black wardrobe, not just as a style choice, but as armor, something to project toughness, control, intimidation. Shaye ran away from home more than once to live with various boyfriends, all of whom were abusive. And then there was the content that she consumed: horror movies, stories, imagery drenched in blood and power. So I want to zoom out for a second because this brings us to a much broader and crucial theme threaded throughout this case, and that is the link between violent media and violent behavior. It's a debate that resurfaces every time a tragedy is traced back to someone's obsession with horror films or true crime or just violent video games, anything of that nature. And the question echoes, does consuming darkness create it? Does it create darkness? Or does it simply reflect what was already there? Research shows that while consistent exposure to violent media can be a significant risk factor, it's not a direct pipeline to committing violent acts. Think of it like cigarettes and lung cancer. We can't say with 100% certainty that smoking will always lead to disease, just like we can't say watching American Psycho is always going to inspire somebody to wield an axe. That said, the correlation is strong enough that we need to pay attention. Psychologist Craig Anderson, who's a PhD and the director of the Center for the Study of Violence at Iowa State University, told Psychiatric Times the following: media violence is only one of the many risk factors for later aggression and violent behavior. Furthermore, extremely violent behavior never occurs when there is only one risk factor present. That's the end of his quote. In other words, violent media doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's one piece of a larger psychological puzzle. You combine that with trauma, mental illness, emotional instability, and environmental stressors, and suddenly that puzzle starts forming a much darker picture, which tragically is what wound up happening with Shaye. By 2017, at 21 years old, Shaye entered a relationship with a man named Ashley Wingham, and the pair welcomed a daughter named Arissa in April of that same year. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for Ashley, the relationship didn't last, and Ashley left Shaye and Arissa to start a new family with a new partner. He actually went on to have more children, and he left Shaye to navigate single motherhood with a growing sense of isolation. Motherhood in general can feel very isolating. I don't mean to tangent, and I know not everybody has this experience, and I'm so happy for you if you didn't. I have a wonderful husband. I have a big family. I live across the street from my parents. I'm super close with my aunts, my uncles, my cousins. I'm very lucky. And yet, I found early motherhood especially to be one of the most isolating experiences I've ever lived through. Can't explain it, or I can't explain it, but I won't, because that's not what this episode is about. But thinking about anybody going through motherhood, as a single parent, my heart does go out for them. At this stage, per usual in Psychopedia, my heart goes out to what Shaye's dealing with at this point. On the surface, she did appear to be doing just fine, right? In spite of her circumstances, maybe even thriving. Her social media painted a picture of domestic bliss, sweet snapshots of her and Arissa baking cupcakes, smiling, playing the part of a wholesome little duo. But as we all know, social media is fucked. It is just smoke and mirrors. Behind the filtered posts and carefully curated captions, Shaye was unraveling. With little to no therapeutic intervention for her, real issues going on and a support system held together by threads, she turned inward, retreating into a world where violence wasn't just present, it was comforting. Something she studied, documented, and eventually romanticized. What I'm saying here is how she romanticized violence, how she kind of immersed herself in horror movies and true crime. It became her comfort zone. Pop quiz. What percentage of Americans are into true crime? I really hope you guys get this, because you are presumably amongst them. If you're in America, we thankfully have a beautiful global audience, but this pop quiz is limited to America. A, 10%, B, 30%, C, 50%. Take a few seconds. C, the answer is 50%. Approximately 50% of Americans enjoy the true crime genre. That's what's up, by the way. With about 13% saying it's their favorite genre, and about 100% saying that their favorite true crime podcast is Psychopedia. Just kidding. One day, guys. Now, it's important to understand that Shaye's connection to true crime was not rooted in casual fascination. It was immersive, compulsive, and psychologically charged. By 2020, it had become a full-blown fixation. And there is a difference between morbid curiosity and interest and being fixated. Many people engage with true crime content as a way to understand the darker facets of human nature. Hi, that's me. Or feel a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Hi, that's also me. Shaye, however, immersed herself in it to a degree that flipped the switch from fascination to identification. In other words, she began to emulate it. She absorbed the killer's behaviors, their rituals, their aesthetics, and treated them not as sick fucks to be feared, but as icons to be admired. She studied their methods, memorized their biographies, and treated their violence as templates. She reportedly idolized Rose West above all else. Rose West was a female serial killer who tortured and murdered at least 9 young women, along with her husband, Fred. We're going to cover, by the way, Rose and Fred West. In Shaye's increasingly darkening world, true crime wasn't just a genre that she listened to driving to work like most of us. It was a goal. By her early 20s, Shaye's fixation on true crime and violence had morphed into something more performative, less about private fascination and more about identity and projection. This was around the time that she began openly discussing her sexual arousal toward knives, framing it not as a metaphor, but as literal, visceral attraction. For the record, this type of arousal, which is often categorized under knife play, or we've talked about this before, hybristophilia, is far from unheard of. It exists at the intersection of fear, control, and desire, and in certain psychological profiles, it can serve as both a coping mechanism and a form of dominance reenactment. It falls within the realm of BDSM edge play, where knives embody that same tension between danger and control. And it's this dynamic, balancing trust, power, and heightened sensation that makes them such a potent, if not controversial, tool in certain sex circles. Anything from butter knives to scalpels to daggers to swords can be used to heighten sensation and psychological intensity in this realm of BDSM. The knives can be dull and safety modified, or they can be dangerously sharp, depending on limits and trust. Because remember, the goal is not violence, really. It's a consensual exchange of power and vulnerability, shifting between gentleness, fear, and the edge of pain. PQ. In knife play, what is the most commonly used type of knife? A non-serrated fixed blade knife with a smooth edge. B, a ceremonial dagger with Viking roots typically. C, a serrated steak knife. The answer is A non-serrated fixed blade knife with a smooth edge, and it's chosen not for cutting, but for sensation, intimidation, and control. All that said about knife play, in Shaye's case, her interest seemed less rooted in erotic expression and more in the desire to actually inflict real pain, suffering, and ultimately, tragically, death. By this point, she had fully leaned into the aesthetic of death, if you will, curating her social media to reflect a gothic, hyper-provocative persona, wearing dark makeup, dark clothing, increasing the number of face piercings and face and neck tattoos, including one that looked like a knife or a dagger or something going through her eye, and intensifying her sexual fixation on violence, control, and domination. At this point, she underwent another psychiatric evaluation as well. And while it's not certainly clear whether a specific incident triggered it or if it was prompted by a broader pattern of ongoing distress, what is clear is that the evaluation confirmed what had long been suspected, which is that she was continuing to struggle with complex PTSD stemming from prolonged, repeated exposure to trauma during childhood. We're talking about sustained sexual and physical abuse. Now, complex PTSD goes beyond flashbacks and anxiety, and that's not to minimize PTSD. It's just to suggest that it's exactly what the name suggests, which is that it's more complex. It can actually warp a person's self-image, damage their ability to form healthy relationships, and leave them in a near constant state of emotional dysregulation. They might alternate between numbness and rage, isolation and dependency, because for people who struggle with this, it's not just about surviving the trauma, it's about living in the aftermath every single day. And in Shaye's case, that aftermath was left untreated for far too long, like her entire life. And untreated PTSD in general, but especially the complex kind, doesn't just fade into the background. It festers, it rewires the nervous system, it distorts perception, and it hijacks behavior. Without proper care, it can transform fear into fury, isolation into obsession, and emotional wounds into dangerous fixations. For Shaye, the untreated trauma became the lens through which she saw the world, and eventually it became the fuel for something far darker. Now, unsurprisingly, Shaye was unable to maintain steady employment. So at this point, she and her daughter moved into a women's shelter and stayed there for quite some time until February 2022, when she was 26 years old. So she was there for years, which is exactly the time when Shaye met a new man from Portsmouth. Enter 25-year-old father of two, Frankie Fitzgerald. Frankie, who worked as a plumber, met Shaye at a bar, and the pair quickly entered into a relationship after bonding over which of the following things? Pop quiz. A bar fight that they both jumped into and walked away from with matching black eyes. B, a drunken karaoke duet of Marilyn Manson's version of Sweet Dreams. C, their shared interest in kinky sex. D, sharing Coke in the bathroom. Pick your poison there, guys. Go ahead, take a few seconds. The answer is C. Shaye and Frankie were both very much into BDSM sex, especially spanking. You're welcome for now having that knowledge in your brain. But believe me, that's going to be like the least descriptive aspect of their sex life that I'm going to be mentioning today. So listen, BDSM sex, especially spanking, whatever, it's all good. Because what don't we do here at Psychopedia Central, guys? We do not kink shame. We do not yuck someone else's yum. We do not ew somebody else's ah. And I kind of just made that one up. I don't know if it flowed, but here we are. Left the mouth and now it's in your ear holes. We don't do that to a point, right? Spanking, it's one thing. But Shaye was into something else as well that I do take a tremendous issue with. And that was rape pornography. And I take issue with this because rape is not a consensual kink or harmless fantasy. It is, under no uncertain terms, a violent crime. And packaging that violence as entertainment or kink doesn't just blur lines, it erases them. It normalizes non-consensual domination, desensitizes viewers to real suffering, and contributes to a culture where consent is treated as optional. That's not kink. That's trauma dressed up in HD. But Shaye was all about that violent lifestyle, both portraying it and, as we will come to hear about momentarily, living it. She began to carry around a flick knife in the heel of her boot and kept a Celtic dagger, a ball-bearing gun, a pellet gun, and 2 Viking axes in her bedroom. According to Shaye, the reason for the dagger in her boot was for use in pagan religious rites. But given what she went on to do with it, I'm calling bullshit on that. So after leaving the women's shelter, Shaye and her daughter moved into council housing in Lee Park with a friend named Lauren White, who also had a young daughter, and they moved in on Botley Drive in Lee Park. So for our listeners that don't live in the UK, council housing is government housing. But this wasn't a typical roommate arrangement. It was a carefully constructed power dynamic. First of all, it said that Shaye was really Lauren's only friend. Lauren was vulnerable. She was socially isolated, emotionally fragile by the sounds of it, and desperate for connection. And Shaye knew this, and she preyed upon this. Because instead of sharing space as equals or as friends, Shaye positioned herself as a figure of dominance and treated Lauren like a personal servant. She issued commands: fetch my clothes, roll my cigarettes, make my tea, put on my socks, which my 11-year-old son insists that I put on his socks. To this day, I won't do it, but he does it because he's lazy. I love him, but very different here than why Shaye was demanding it. Shaye wanted somebody literally on her knees at her feet, doing her bidding. Shaye was exhibiting calculated control, emotional manipulation, and establishment of a psychological hierarchy where her needs always came first and Lauren's compliance became the norm. Additionally, Shaye was reportedly physically violent towards Lauren on 2 occasions and also did which of the following things? Pop quiz. What else did Shaye do to further control and manipulate her roommate Lauren? A, she hid Lauren's belongings like her keys and cell phone to make Lauren feel like she was losing her mind. B, Shaye told Lauren that she had cancer. C, Shaye locked the snack cabinet and told Lauren that food was a reward, not a right. 5 seconds, go. The answer is B, which is so fucked up. Shaye told Lauren that she had cancer. a lie as cruel as it was strategic. She used it to elicit sympathy, obedience, even money, slowly binding Lauren to her through fear and compassion. And it wasn't just words. This is wild. Shaye followed through with this lie. She would sit in waiting rooms, undergo tests, and she would weave a false reality so convincing that Lauren catered to her wants and needs, as one might do if they think their friend is really suffering from a disease. And this continued, unchecked, unchallenged, as Shaye's behavior toward Frankie now grew increasingly volatile as well. Shaye was obsessed with Frankie. He occupied her every waking thought, every ounce of her emotional bandwidth. She patrolled his text messages, was convinced he was sleeping with his ex, who's the mother of his 2 children, and that he contracted thrush from another woman, which he then passed on to Shaye because she realized that she had vaginal thrush. And similarly, Frankie exhibited controlling, obsessive, jealous behaviors towards Shaye as well. He was constantly accusing her of cheating on him with her ex, a man named Declan Payne, and expressing feelings of inadequacy for not being able to keep the relationship together. Meanwhile, Frankie happened to have been right about that. Shaye was sleeping with Declan, and we know this because Shaye videotaped their sexual encounters, which was her thing and which we're going to be talking about in great length in a little bit. Shaye's relationship with Frankie was toxic at best and ultimately lethal at worst. In early May 2022, text messages between Frankie and Shaye ranged from expressions of love to more menacing messages whereby Frankie called Shaye a fucking slut and suggested that her response to that should just be, quote unquote, yes, daddy. To which Shaye actually responded with, I'm sorry, daddy. Of course I'll do as I'm told and listen to everything daddy says. And then he responded to that with, you're such a good little whore, to which Shaye answered, only for you. So we're seeing this like completely blurry line between real toxicity and this sort of consensual negativity, if you will. It was a very gray area that they lived in, and it became very dangerous, understandably. I think what we're seeing here was role-playing between Shaye and Frankie, but not just strictly role-playing. It was definitely a real toxic relationship where they were really insulting each other, really lacking in the trust area, we'll say. And then their very real fights, I think the escalation got them both going, and it would then transition into this, role-playing, I'm sorry, daddy, when a minute ago she was legitimately cursing him out. And this is why it became so dangerous, because that line was sort of always blurry for them. So remember earlier I mentioned Shaye's interest in rape pornography? Well, her sexual appetite extended beyond pornography in that realm, because she told Frankie that she wanted to engage in what she referred to as consensual rape. That's an oxymoron if I've ever heard one. In fact, she even went on to go so far as to draw up a sex contract with Frankie, which they both signed on March 22nd, and which was witnessed by their friend Vicky Baytup, in which she purported to consent to him. So Shaye purported to consenting to have Frankie acting like he was raping her during consensual sexual intercourse. Now, BDSM contracts like this are actually encouraged in order to promote open discussion and negotiation in advance, as are safe words in case the participant changes his or her mind at any point. Location, length of time of the experience, the plot of the experience, all of that is supposed to be predetermined and agreed upon, and a contract can help lay everything out for participants. BDSM contracts and documents like it, though, actually have not been recognized, which is not surprising, as being legally binding, nor are they intended to be. Again, it's just a way to clearly predetermine what is acceptable behavior and what is not, because it's supposed to present as non-consensual, but really with your partner or partners, you want to make sure that's what's actually happening has been consented to. In terms of Shaye's desire to be what she referred to as consensually raped, this falls under what is known as consensual non-consent, or CNC. So let's talk about this for a second, because this is actually, I think, really interesting. Consensual rape, aka rape fantasy or rape play, is a sexual fantasy that involves imagining non-consensual sexual activity, typically being overpowered, coerced, or quote-unquote taken against one's will. And it's more common than you might think. Current research indicates that between 31% and 57% of women have fantasies in which they are forced, but with their consent, into sex against their will. This sounds very confusing, right? Because it is. But I understand it. Like, the more I researched it, the more I understood it. It is important to clarify that rape fantasies are consensual in nature. And I think that's why I said earlier that's an oxymoron if I've ever heard of one, consensual rape. But it's just to say that without consent, it's not a fantasy, it's a crime. So, what drives arousal toward rape fantasy? Well, it's really complex, but based on what I uncovered in my research, there are several psychological factors that may contribute. First off, a common misconception about CNC fantasies is that people who have these fantasies must have some mental health problems. That does not seem to be the case. Sexual behaviors like CNC, dominance, or aggression do not necessarily have a link to emotional disturbance, pathology, or childhood trauma, but it can. For some, it can be about reclaiming control, particularly in the aftermath of real-life sexual trauma. And this could be what was happening with Shaye. In these cases, the fantasy becomes a way to reframe the narrative where the individual sets the rules, controls the outcome, and therefore transforms fear into agency. For others, it's rooted in sexual curiosity or just boundary-pushing exploration, a way to safely engage with intense power dynamics within a consensual, controlled environment. And for some, the appeal is more complex. Rape fantasy can provide emotional, plausible deniability, if you will. If they're playing the role of someone being forced into taboo or highly stigmatized acts, they may feel less shame or judgment experiencing it because in the context of the scene, they quote-unquote had no choice. Even though the fantasy is fully consensual, it allows them in the moment that they're experiencing it to bypass responsibility for desiring what they've been taught to see as unacceptable. Of course, this is only a brief overview. Rape fantasy is a deeply complex subject shaped by intricate psychological and social dynamics. But one thing that really stood out to me about rape play, specifically what was missing in Shaye and Frankie's dynamic, is the crucial component of aftercare. So in healthy, consensual, non-consent scenarios, aftercare is essential. Partners are encouraged to care for each other emotionally and physically after the scene has taken place, talking through the experience, offering reassurance, comfort, and gentle affection to reestablish trust and safety. But with Shaye and Frankie, there was none of that. And for Shaye, that chaos wasn't just lived, it was also documented and then relived because she took things a step further by videotaping her sexual encounters with Frankie and went so far as to set up cameras in her bedroom and all over the house. So it wasn't about intimacy or connection necessarily. It was about control, performance, and then having the footage to relive or, as we'll see, weaponize the experience later. Shaye also had camera, as I mentioned, set up in other areas of her house, like the kitchen and living room. Again, control. She needed to know exactly what was happening with everyone, everywhere, at all times. On May 30th, video footage from Shaye's bedroom revealed a discussion in which Shaye agreed to undergo punishment at Frankie's hands. Shaye asked what the punishment would be and whether it would make her cry. Frankie then proceeded to spank Shaye's bottom more than 100 times, the first 54 in 6 minutes. Shaye was required to respond after each slap with, "Sorry, Daddy," or "I'll be a good girl for you, Daddy." Later on, Frankie ordered Shaye to start counting the slaps out loud. She counted at least 36 before stopping and complaining that it really hurt and saying, "Please, no more, no more." But he continued. Prior to that, there were instances during which Shaye claimed to have been truly afraid of Frankie outside of a CNC context. On May 12th, for example, Frankie texted Shaye saying that he would, quote, snap her in half if she slept with anyone else and that he'd stamp on her other lover. Shaye actually passed this message on to her close friend, Vicky, who I mentioned earlier. She's the one who witnessed the signing of the sex contract. And Shaye referred to this as a, quote, threat and a half. She even showed selected video footage of Frankie penetrating her anally, during which she was clearly in pain, to try to suggest to Vicky that she'd been raped outside of a CNC scenario. In response, Vicky indicated that she was genuinely concerned for Shaye's safety. So they just live in this constant gray area, and their entire relationship seemed to center around sex. It does seem to be sort of this mutual obsession. So on the same day that that video footage was taken, that Shaye, used to show Vicky that she was really, in trouble here with Frankie, additional video footage showed that Shaye kept a dagger underneath her pillow while having sex with Frankie, which prompted Frankie, on video, we can see this, to ask whether she intended to stab him in the throat with it. Shaye's response was that she did not, but that the dagger was there to be easily accessible for protection, not against Frankie, just in general. Then the camera shows Frankie attempting to have anal sex with Shaye, but Shaye saying no, prompting them to have vaginal sex instead. And I bring this up for a reason, because this becomes a sticking point, no pun intended, during the eventual trial. They went on to eventually have anal sex, after which Shaye commented laughingly that it had been, quote unquote, as close to non-rape rape as I can get. And that if she thought he had actually raped her, then, quote, you wouldn't be in my house as I have a kid to protect. Again, this becomes important at trial because following the murder, which I introduced in the intro, so it's not exactly a spoiler, and which I'm getting to now, Shaye claimed that Frankie indeed anally raped her outside of the CNC context. So then you have this video footage here where she's saying, no, that wasn't real. If it was real, I'd kick you out of my house. Jealous, paranoid, and convinced that Frankie was hiding something, Shaye waited until the early hours of July 13th, 2022, when Frankie was fast asleep, to quietly look through his phone. And that's when she discovered some Facebook messages between Frankie and someone who indicated that she was a 13-year-old girl. And just like that, the fantasy that Shaye had so carefully built around Frankie ignited, torched in an instant, consumed by betrayal, and reduced to ash. And the pain cut like a knife. Yes, pun was very much intended. Now, there's no public record detailing the full context of Frankie's conversation with this girl who initially claimed that she was 13. But what is known is that he did block her immediately after she revealed her age. By the way, P.S., it was later determined that this girl was actually 17, not 13. She's still a child, though, 17. But none of that even mattered to Shaye. The moment she saw those messages, she snapped, and her reaction looked less like a breakup and more like stabbing Frankie in the throat 3 times with a Celtic dagger while he slept. Frankie jolted awake, gurgling, eyes wide with shock as blood sprayed across the bedsheets. He stumbled out of bed, clutching his neck, and staggered to the wall like he was trying to hold himself upright through sheer will. Then slowly, almost gracefully, he began to slide down the wall, smearing a streak of blood behind him as he sank to the floor, the sound of his breath replaced by the wet bubbling of a wound too deep to recover from. According to Shaye, Frankie's chest had gone still, but he was still making this gurgling noise, these inhuman sounds through the open wound in his neck, wet, rattling sounds that made it clear that he was dying, just not fast enough. And that's when Shaye claimed it hit her. She'd really killed him. Panicked now, she said she tried to stop the bubbling by pressing her hand over the wound, but it was useless. His blood poured out through her fingers like water through a sieve. So she did what any reasonable person in that situation would have done. She decided to stab him in the chest and heart 19 additional times. And Frankie Fitzgerald was absolutely slaughtered. The first wound inflicted was inevitably and swiftly fatal. The back of his throat was opened internally. The left internal jugular vein was completely severed and the left common carotid artery partially severed, causing torrential bleeding and rapid loss of consciousness, and then, of course, death. There were no defensive injuries. Shaye then proceeded to stab Frankie in the heart and chest a further 19 times, as mentioned, creating additional wounds that would have been fatal, but when they were inflicted, Frankie was already dead. And what Shaye did next, following the murder, completely defies comprehension. Pop quiz. What did Shaye do after brutally murdering her boyfriend? A, wrote, quote, "Still daddy's girl" on the bedroom wall with Frankie's blood. B, masturbated. C, FaceTimed her friend Vicky to show off the carnage. Take a few seconds, you freaks. Incredibly, horrifyingly, I mean, they're all horrifying, but the answer is C. 4 hours after committing homicide, Shaye FaceTimed Vicky, giggling, to show her the blood spatter on the bookcase as she attempted to scrub it clean. During the video chat, Shaye's roommate Lauren could also be heard in the room saying to Shaye, "I'm going to crack." Then Shaye was heard telling Lauren, "You can't crack. You're an accomplice now. You put the bin bags under his body. Like, let's go." Shaye simply explained to Lauren that Frankie had been suicidal anyway and that it was all right. They'll just assume that he'd gone off and committed suicide. They meaning what? His friends, his family, the world? I mean, it's so ridiculous. When Lauren asked what Shaye planned to do with Frankie's body, Shaye replied, quote, "It's all right. We're going to bury him in the back garden." A pathologist report revealed that Frankie indeed died after multiple perforations of his heart and lungs and due to catastrophic blood loss. Needless to say, Shaye Groves was arrested in her home on July 17th, 2022, after Vicky called the police to report a homicide. I don't know what Shaye expected when she FaceTimed her fucking friend to show off the murder. I think, and this is not, in my notes here, but just upon thinking about it, I think Shaye thought she was in control of absolutely everyone in her life. And I think that she really and truly thought that if she told Vicky to keep it under wraps and she told Lauren to keep it under wraps, that they would. And we go on to this later. I think Shaye Groves, and this is my own musing. I did not see this pop up in any of her reports or any of my research. I think she really has some serious narcissism going on. But more on that in a little bit. So over the next few days after her arrest, Shaye was interviewed by police under caution in the presence of her solicitor 3 times in total. During the first 2 sessions, Shaye offered nothing but a flat no comment. But in the third interview, her strategy shifted. She hinted at self-defense and questioned the narrative, suggesting that if she had indeed attacked Frankie while he slept, wouldn't the bed be covered in blood? Like she thinks what? She's smarter than the forensic team? Anyway, detectives quickly shut that down. They explained that Frankie had rolled off the mattress almost immediately after the initial stab wound and that she had then wrapped his body up in a blanket that, for the record, was indeed soaked through with his blood. Additionally, Shaye did not show any remorse in her conversation with the mental health nurse in the afternoon of July 17th, which is when the body was technically discovered after Vicky called the police. So that same day, the day of the murder, she showed 0 remorse. Now, later on, Shaye did wind up writing an apology letter from prison while on trial, dated Tuesday, February 14th, while the jury was deliberating. She apologized to Frankie's family and his children and expressed remorse that, according to the judge, appeared to be genuine. But it came very late, right at the end of the trial when the verdict was imminent. Funny timing, I would say. But that's the end of the trial. I want to start at the beginning, all right? Despite the evidence, Shaye's legal team submitted a plea of not guilty and pursued a self-defense strategy at trial, alleging that Frankie had been consistently abusive throughout their volatile relationship and that on the night of the murder, he attempted to strangle Shaye. The presiding judge, Mr. Justice Kerr, acknowledged that he did believe that Frankie was indeed abusive toward Shaye at times. However, he also noted that Shaye had deliberately exaggerated or outright manipulated the video footage that she recorded in her home in an apparent attempt to paint Frankie as more violent than he actually was. So, for example, one instance where I know she did this is when she sent the video footage to Vicky. So they had anal sex. And it was painful, and nobody was taking that away from Shane, but she spliced the footage to make it look like she'd been anally raped. So that's what the judge is referring to here. Now, Justice Kerr stated, quote, I accept the submission of the Crown that you deliberately selected the parts of that sexual activity which portrayed Frankie inflicting or appearing to inflict non-consensual sexual violence on you to convey the false impression that his actions were abusive of you to a far greater extent than they actually were. Though that is not to say that I find you consented to all the activity depicted in your edited versions of it. Parts of the activity were not consensual." End quote. He also went on to indicate, another quote, "When having otherwise consensual sex with Frankie, but not on camera," okay, guys, this gets graphic, so I'm sorry. "He, quote, fisted and, quote, sunflowered you, causing you discomfort, pain, and injury. I accept that this was not consensual and that it was a serious sexual assault on you." End quote. Now, I admittedly had to look up what sunflowering is, and I very, very much regret that Google search with every fiber of my being. I don't recommend you look it up if you don't know what it is. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's your thing. I do not kink shame. It just sounds painful to me. Moving on. The judge accepted that Frankie was far from blameless. He was a violent man who threatened Shaye and sexually assaulted her, according to the judge. He acknowledged that Shaye was in some fear of Frankie and that he was a danger to her at times, as she was to him. At some point, the lines blurred so terribly between consensual violent BDSM sex to domestic violence both ways. In terms of the prosecution, they argued that Shaye murdered Frankie out of jealous rage, that after finding those texts on his phone, Shaye feared that Frankie might leave her, and so to prevent that from happening, she killed him. What makes this dynamic even more disturbing is how classic it is in the world of criminal psychology. Many violent offenders don't kill strangers, they kill the people closest to them. And often it's not premeditated revenge. It's impulsive, emotionally explosive, and rooted in abandonment trauma. Shaye's reported obsession with true crime and serial killers may have given her a distorted blueprint for how to reclaim that control, which was to eliminate the threat, eliminate Frankie. And in a moment of rage, rejection, and catastrophic emotional dysregulation, she did exactly that. In the end, the court determined that Shaye Groves did not kill Frankie out of self-defense. Rather, it was ruled a crime of passion, impulsive, violent, and deeply personal. While not premeditated in the traditional sense, the judge found that Shaye had mentally and emotionally prepared for such an act, stockpiling weapons in her bedroom and maintaining a fixation on violence, control, and dominance, and that her dark persona and obsession with serial killers blurred dangerously into real life. The presence of the weapons in her bedroom, there to be used in case of need, involved a certain level of planning. And it was that planning that eventually enabled a crime like this one to be committed, along with Shaye's willingness to actually commit it, should the occasion arise, which in this case, in her mind, it did. Also, Shaye joked around with Vicky in the past about how her picture would one day be hanging up next to the serial killers on her wall after she decided to finally kill Frankie. Not so fucking funny now, is it? The fatal attack itself followed Shaye's discovery of messages between Frankie and a girl who claimed to be 13. Although he blocked the contact immediately, it still caused Shaye to snap. She stabbed Frankie in the neck while he slept, followed it up with 19 additional chest wounds that was described as a frenzied overkill. The excessive force, the vulnerability of the victim, and the use of a dagger kept under the pillow were considered significant aggravating factors. And aggravating factors, you guys, amplify or elevate a regular murder charge. The reason why prosecution likes to add in aggravating factors is because it heavily impacts the sentence. The court also cited Shaye's manipulation of evidence, editing sex tapes on her laptop to exaggerate abuse, threatening to leak them, attempting to fabricate an alibi, right? Like she said to Lauren, Frankie was suicidal anyway, so we can just kind of run with this story, implicating a friend, as this is all clear efforts to distort the narrative. Her behavior after the murder, including calling Vicky while giggling and showing off Frankie's dead body on video, further illustrates Shaye's disturbing lack of remorse. While her diagnosis of emotionally unstable personality disorder offered limited mitigation, the court concluded that her impulsivity, jealousy, and performative violence culminated in a calculated display of dominance. If she couldn't have Frankie, no one would. Ergo, nice, after 4 days of jury deliberation, Shaye Groves was found guilty at the Winchester Crown Court, the same court her serial killer icon, Rose West, was jailed at in 1995. Shaye was sentenced to 26 years in prison, reflecting both the brutality of the crime and her disturbing capacity for manipulation. Pop quiz. Right after being found guilty of murder, what did Shaye do? A. Physically lashed out at her attorney, Shabizna style. B. Thanked the jury for making her as infamous as her serial killer icons. C. Smiled. Go. The answer is C. While sporting a satanic jacket, that's what all the sources say. I think it had like a pentagram on it. Shaye smiled after being pronounced guilty of murder. With everything said until this point, I've attempted to devise a psychological profile on Shaye Groves because you guys know I love to do this, right? We know that she's been diagnosed at various points in her life with complex PTSD and bipolar affective disorder. We also know that she'd been living with untreated trauma and feelings and emotions relating to an abusive upbringing. In my totally unprofessional opinion, but wearing the hat of an FBI profiler because I just fucking love this hat, I'm going to take my crack here with some other possibilities of what's going on, okay? In terms of psychological traits and disorders, Shaye seems to have exhibited possible narcissistic tendencies, which I touched upon earlier, particularly in her need to be admired and validated by others. This may have manifested in her need for dominance and control in all of her relationships, as well as her inability to tolerate perceived rejection or disrespect. Shaye possibly also struggled with symptoms of borderline personality disorder, or BPD, including emotional dysregulation, impulsivity, and unstable interpersonal relationships. Now, individuals with BPD often struggle with fears of abandonment, it can lead to intense, volatile relationships. Shaye's violent outbursts could be an extreme reaction to perceived emotional threats. Now, I just want to say this. BPD and or possible narcissistic tendencies does not necessarily always obviously lead to murder. So anybody with these issues is not going to become a murderer. I'm just saying in this case, I think that these issues may have been there for Shaye Groves. Now, in terms of behavioral predictions, Shaye demonstrated social manipulation, whether to garner sympathy and or attention. She framed herself as a victim and attempted to justify her actions in a manner that minimized personal responsibility. Psychological projection. Shaye seemed to have projected her own emotional instability and insecurities onto Frankie, which prevented her from fully acknowledging the severity of her own behavior and therefore seeking the treatment that she so desperately needed. Then there were patterns of reoffending. In my opinion, absolutely. Based on her psychological makeup, I believe that Shaye could be prone to repeat violence, particularly if she perceives herself as being in a vulnerable or threatened emotional state. She may also continue to seek relationships in which she can exert dominance or control over her partner. So I believe Shaye Groves also checks the boxes for being 1, an instrumental killer, meaning she had a clear instrumental motive, which was to regain control or resolve perceived emotional or psychological turmoil in her relationship. She sought to eliminate a perceived threat or dissatisfaction within her intimate partner dynamic, which is characteristic of instrumental violence, where the act is driven by the desire to achieve a specific goal, such as emotional resolution or reclaiming power. 2, she's also a reactive or impulse killer. And 3, which very closely aligns to being a reactive killer, is something called precipitous killer. Based on available information, Shaye appears to have committed the homicide in an emotionally charged, high-stress moment, indicating that she may be a precipitous killer, one who commits murder in response to immediate provocation, often driven by a perceived betrayal or emotional injury, rather than as part of a long-term methodical plan. And this obviously aligns with the reactive homicide profile seen in many intimate partner killings. In summary here, my little mock FBI profile, Shaye Groves is a domestic intimate partner killer with characteristics of a narcissistic and emotionally volatile individual. Her crime is a manifestation of deep emotional instability, reactive violence, and an overwhelming need for control within her personal relationships. These factors, combined with possible borderline personality disorder and narcissistic traits, likely contributed to her decision to murder Frankie Fitzgerald. Following the verdict, Frankie Fitzgerald's family made the following heartfelt statement. As a parent, you never expect to outlive your children. You will do anything in your power to protect them. Frankie was our baby, the youngest of 5 children. He can never be replaced. He was a kind and beautiful person and sadly leaves 2 children behind that will never get to know their daddy. We thank the jury for their verdict today. To our Frankie, we love and miss you more than anything in this world. Your shining light will always be in our hearts. And that's the case. Very intense case. It was interesting to attack this one. I also will admit to not knowing too much. I mean, I know more now that I've done the research, obviously, than I did before doing this case, but consensual, non-consensual sex and rape fantasy, as I said, it's more common than I certainly thought it was. So I don't have any judgment, and I hope I didn't come across as being like, well, that's an oxymoron. I keep going back to the fact that I said that because I don't mean to judge it, because it really is very much a real sexual fantasy. And when it is consensual, what's the problem, right? If it's consensual, it's a funny topic for me because of the space I work in and because of my passion to just represent survivors of sexual abuse. I think one of the reasons, or maybe the predominant reason why, I'm a little uncomfortable with the subject matter or with the concept of CNC is because the line between fantasy and crime is so very thin. So that leap, right, from consensual to non-consensual seems like it's a tiny itty bitty little step. And that's that would concern me. So I hope that everybody realizes my presentation of this information is just based on my research and me just learning new things, which is very exciting. It's very exciting to be 2 years into this podcast and still learning things. That's my goal, really. I love to study this stuff. I love to present it. And I hope that you guys love to hear it. Before I let you go, I just want to mention that on Instagram and TikTok, on Investigator Slater in particular, I'm doing some creative stuff with my content. So I'm going to encourage you guys to check it out. My handle is exactly that. It's at Investigator Slater. Thank you so much for listening. Again, as always, it is never lost on me that you are here with me. And I hope that you understand how genuinely grateful I am for your support and your ears and your heart and your kind words. If you like this episode, I would love for you to leave me a nice review. I read every single thing that is written about me, about this podcast, about the cases. So keep that in mind. Other than that, you guys, I can't wait to see you next week. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.